All right, church, good morning. My name is Ben. If you haven't had the opportunity to meet, I have the honor of serving here at Downtown Community Church as the lead pastor. Like William said, man, we got football coming up in a week or so. And I just want to say, when we moved into our last building, we went on a hot streak, won a national championship, won about 29 games straight. And so I'm not saying correlation is causation, but I am praying that it is this time, okay? Because I would love to be good again. Anyways, so we're in this series, in the beginning of this series called Anchor. But before we kind of launch into today, I want to say a couple things. Number one is thank you guys for being here. I mean, it doesn't escape me that many of you are young. Many of you are at the point where you don't have to go to church. Your parents aren't making you go to church. You're at college. You're a young professional. You're starting the working world, or you're kind of, what we call the varsity, which is anybody over 30 years old at our church, right? And all of you decided to be here. And so we're just so thankful for you. A couple people specific. I got one of my old childhood friends, my buddy Matthew here today, and our friend Mike. And many of you who are sitting, everybody's for the most part sitting right now, but you owe a great deal of debt and gratitude to Mike, and as we all do, because Mike is the one that was presiding over the building projects for months and months and months. And so if we could give Mike a huge round of applause to say thank you so much. He has probably spent more time in our church over the last year than most of you ever will, but because of his work and his diligence, so thank you, Mike, for all that you have done. Man, this series, Anchor, is pretty fun, and the thing behind it, if you spend much time on the water, you know kind of the function of an anchor, and I don't know how many of you have ever thought, like, man, on a conceptual level, on an existential level, how do I think about anchors, right? If you do, you need to get a life because there's not that much to it, right? But the idea of an anchor is simply this. It's that an anchor keeps you from drifting while allowing you to float, fluctuate, accommodate to the shifting of the waves and of the winds and of what happens on the surface. And we're drawing kind of an analogy between that and the church. That is to say, as a church, culture moves very fast. And I don't have to convince you of that and tell you about that, but you're all a witness to it. The quickness of the news cycles, everything from life and social media to cryptocurrencies and everything in between, right? Like if you would have told us 5 years ago that people were going to have this little thing called an NFT, a non-fungible token, where you could buy a digital version of something and that would be worth a lot of money potentially. Who knows if it actually will be or not, right? But if you would have said that, we would have all been like, dude, that's ridiculous, right? We email files. We don't buy files. Or you download maybe something. But our world changes really fast. And the problem that creates with the church, and in fact, the problem that creates for Christians, is that Christians are tasked with the job or the responsibility of putting the timelessness of Jesus in a package or in a way or in a phrasing or in a context that's timely for the context and the culture that we live in. And there's a bunch of churchy ways to say that, the timeless truth in a timely fashion, an everlasting truth in an ever-changing culture, things like that to say. But that is to simply say that you live in the real world. You live in a world, and I live in a world, and we live in a world where we're continually fighting to say, how does this timeless, this historical, this what we believe to be divinely inspired idea of God, this text of the Bible, and how do we conceptualize that and contextualize that to our current culture? And so over the next 3 weeks, we are dropping 3 different anchors that help to anchor us, that give us hopefully the flexibility to understand how we accommodate and how we adjust to culture, and at the same time keep us anchored from drifting too far. And let me tell you why that's important. If you're here and you're wrestling with faith as an adult, you perhaps were handed a Sunday school faith. The Sunday school faith met the rigors of the real world, and your Sunday school faith fell, right? You had an Old Testament professor that talked about the opposition of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. They talked about Isaiah written in 3 parts. They talked about the lack of continuity between the Gospels or something along those lines, right? And it shook you. It shook your faith. And now as an adult, you're trying to figure out, well, what do I believe? What do I think? If there's one thing that I think keeps us from actually engaging with God in a meaningful way, it's this. It's that we have had churches or seen churches or experienced people who are Christians who went to one extreme or the other, right? One extreme of that is that there's a group of people who they are so anti. It becomes like a Christian commune, a little bomb shelter, and we kind of refuse to deal with anything or have anything to do with it that has to do with anything with the world. In other words, this is the person like the church I grew up in where you could not clap. Anybody have a non-clap in church? Thank you. All right, one person makes me feel seen. Somebody's like clarity. Yes, thank you. I've never gotten such a church eye than from my aunt, who, bless her heart, which is in our southern way of saying, you are terrible at life. No, I remember when I was young, and man, this person, they did like this solo, and everyone in the church, and everything was organs and stained glass, and the brought to, that whole type of thing. And they just killed this solo. I'm talking about R.I.P. to this solo. No one should ever do it again. It was incredible, right? I remember thinking like, wow. Like, I wasn't that old. I was probably, 12. But I remember hearing, I was just like, and you ever clap, and you're literally the only one who claps? And my aunt looked at me, and I was like, I didn't realize I was the devil, right? It was this, and obviously I'm not really, but, well, obviously. Anyways, you're like, I thought he might be. That confirms my suspicion. No, right, but there's just this sense of rigidity that honestly, it just makes faith, it makes God, it makes it seem so irrelevant and off-putting. And on the other end of that, a lot of us have experienced this thing where churches where the people of God just become a mirror of everything that culture does and everything culture values. And the problem with that is you look at that, and part of your experience, perhaps, and what your aversion to faith is that some of you have experienced a faith or experienced the embodiment of faith of God through the people of God that makes it seem irrelevant. And then some of us have experienced the other side of that, which means that it's no different than anything else. Nothing interesting, nothing distinctive. There's not this sense of love. There's not this sense of forgiveness. There's not this sense. We just value what culture values and do what culture does. And we're a mirror as a church. And so what are the things, or the common anchors, the irreducible minimums of faith, if you will, that create for us anchors in how we are to not drift too far, yet at the same time have the agility as a group of people, as an organization, as an entity, or as individuals, to actually understand and contextualize this timeless message to our culture. Well, Jesus dealt with this, thankfully. Jesus dealt with kind of honing all of this stuff, and there was a time in Matthew 22 where Jesus is walking around. Matthew is a guy who followed Jesus, was one of Jesus' close disciples, and as Jesus was walking around, oftentimes people would try to argue with him and shut him down, which was a terrible idea because he's Jesus. He's a pretty smart dude. And when they would do that, they would say, here's this thought that we're going to throw at you. And so a couple of people had, to this point, tried to put stuff in opposition to Jesus. But this one person specifically has a question for Jesus, and in Jesus' answer gives us two of the anchors. We're going to talk about one this week. But this is what happens in Matthew chapter 22, verse 34. But the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees. And so they gathered together. Now, this was their probably internal conversation. They saw the Sadducees had tried to stump Jesus, didn't work. And since that didn't work, the Pharisees all get together and say, hey, we see a window of opportunity here. This is a business, this is our competitive advantage that we're going to be able to shut down Jesus when the Sadducees couldn't. And so they all got together. These were the smart people. They decided to understand the law, take the law, and say, what question can we ask Jesus to back him into a corner to make this virtually unanswerable? So they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, which we would all just say classic, asked him a question to test him, which I'm sure none of you have ever met a lawyer that thinks they're smarter than Jesus, of course. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? They had over 600 commandments in the Old Testament. And beyond that, they would create commandments outside of those commandments as guardrails for the commandments that they didn't want to break. So they had hundreds, if not thousands, of commandments and laws and rules and thou shalls and thou shalt nots and thou shalls and thou shalt nots. And they began to kind of maybe feel overwhelmed by it. Perhaps they were trying to trick Jesus to a false sense of weighting, because they would oftentimes weight the really heavy ones compared to what they felt like were the really light ones. And so he looks at Jesus, the lawyer, the teacher, the Sadducee, or the Pharisee, and says, Jesus, which one of these is most important? And he said to him, and this is interesting. I just want to pause before I read it. Jesus accepts the premise, which is fascinating. Because Jesus could have easily said, basically, nah, fam. There is no one that's better than the other one. They're all the same. You keep all of laws, you keep all the things, which in essence was true. But Jesus said, okay, if you really want to know, If you really want to know, if you took all of the commandments, all of the laws, all of the things, all of the guardrails that you have around the laws to make sure you don't break any of those laws, then let me tell you, if you were to summarize the irreducible minimum at the core of this entire thing, there is a single commandment that is the greatest commandment that you can have, that you can know, that you can keep, and there's one that's attached to it. And so he says, okay, I'm going to accept your premise that there is something at the core of this whole thing. And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commands or commandments depend the law and the prophets. In other words, you want me to boil it down? If you were to take every single commandment, every single part of the law, every single part of the prophets, everything, all the thou shalls, all the thou shalt nots, all the, if you're from the South, all the you ought tos and you ought not tos, right? If you were to take all of those, lump them all together, here's what you'd find. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. So today we're going to talk about the first one of those, which is to love the Lord your God. So our first anchor, if you're taking notes, is to love God. Our first anchor is to love God. And as I say that, I realize that a lot of us, that's like, I don't know that anybody woke up this morning like, what? That is revolutionary, right? Hold on, can you say it again? I'm supposed to what? Love God. Okay, 7 letters, right? Yeah, okay, love God. Whew. Glad I came to church this morning. Amen, let's pray. Go home next week. Right? Virtually all of us know that conceptually. And here's my premise to this honestly, the entire series, is that very few of the things that we're going to talk about are things that we're going to talk about that you didn't know before. Really good chance no one's going to be like, what? I have never heard that Christians are to be people who love God. I don't think any of the stuff is new conceptually. I think virtually all of it's going to be new experientially. In other words, there's a difference between what we know and what we actually do. There's a difference between what we know and what we actually feel. And so Jesus looks at him and says, okay, here's the irreducible minimum. You would love the Lord your God. You would love God with all your heart, actually as Jesus says it, with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. At different point in times, they take one out and put one in and say strength and things like that. But the essence of this is he's saying, okay, I want you to love God with all of your heart. Kind of some of the internal desires, thoughts, and affections. I want you to love the Lord with all your soul. That soul is, it's an interesting word in the Greek, which I know everybody's like, dude, I was just wondering what the Greek translation of soul is. So for everybody, let me just kind of clarify that for you. Soul basically was this word, shuka, and shuka eventually became the word that we have as psych, and psych is what we paired with ology, which means the study of, which means psychology functionally means in the Greek, the study of the soul, right? And so it's kind of like this interior, below the surface, somewhat subconscious control panel of the human heart, mind, thoughts, and affections. He says, and with all your mind, that you would love God. And I would love God. So here's where I am with this today. As I was thinking about this and praying about this, just thinking, okay, what is this? Here's what I think we miss. Virtually everybody in here knows that they should love God. But most of us have a thought towards God and a love for God that rivals that of me to my aunt, which is somewhat juvenile and somewhat obligatory. Right? Like, I know I should love God. But when you love something. But when you're willing to do anything for that thing. Like for some of us, man, we paid a crazy amount of money to go watch teenagers throw pigskin around, right? And we love it. And we're going to buy shirts for it, and we're going to buy jerseys for it. We're going to do all this stuff, right? We would gladly, and some of us, right? I mean, you're so weird. You actually go on road trips. You drive somewhere to do that, right? Let me just tell you, as one of you, I am one of you, right? Like before we were bad, before we got good, we're bad, we were good, but we were bad the first time, right? Like I went to every single away football game, home and away, for 2 7 and 6 years, I think, in a row. Pray for me, okay? Right? But those are the things we love. If you fall in love with someone, everything revolves around this person. They're the most important thing. They're the thing that you look forward to, the things that you defer to. They're the ones that has your thoughts, your heart, your mind, your objectives, your ideas. And all of us love something. The question is are we actually in love with God? It's difficult. It's difficult because I think we want to be fair. But when's the last time we actually sat down and like, dude, I am just in love with God right now. Like crazy in love with God. Like everything in my world revolves around God right now. And I am just massively in love with him. I love God. I'm crazy in love with God. I think we want to be. But I think if we were to do a real and honest biopsy of our heart and the condition that it's in, what we would find is that we, generally speaking as a people, have an acknowledgement and a deference towards God, but not a full heart, soul, mind, strength, love for God. And the problem is you know as well as I do, is love is not necessarily something you can control, right? That's why you guys keep dating a bunch of weirdos, right? You're sitting there and like, man, I don't know why I always fall for these weirdos. It's like because you're around weirdos a lot, right? That's just what it is, right? But and if you could, you have this other person and they're awesome and they're stable and they're steady and you're like, I don't know why I don't like this person. They're just not exciting. They're kind of mediocre at best, right? But you wish that your heart, because they're what's best for you. You have this other person and they have a motorcycle, which is stupid. Just don't right? And they have like a tattoo and you're like, whoa, they have a tattoo. Cool. It's probably bad anyways because they can't afford something good because they're not old enough to make money yet. Anyways. Just kidding for the most part. But here's the idea, right? It's tough because you can't make yourself fall in love with somebody. And so the problem I find functionally with the idea of the greatest single commandment that we have to face, I mean, the epicenter, right? Love for neighbor comes as a byproduct or as a result. He said it's like it, it's attached to it. It comes as a byproduct of this, that the biggest commandment that we have seems functionally uncontrollable by us who are supposed to keep the commandment. So how do we fall in love with God? I think that question is the anchor, or the answer to that question is the anchor that I think is the irreducible minimum. It is the epicenter of our entire faith, is how do you fall in love with God? How do I fall in love with God? When we're in the moment, at the time, in the season, come to the realization, I like God, I have a deference towards God, I want to love God. It's tough because I don't, but I want to. What do I actually do? Well, the good thing is in the book 1 John, John answers that question. If you got your Bible, you can flip to 1 John. We're going to have the verses on the screen. But 1 John, it's a little confusing because Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are all accounts of Jesus' life. And then the Bible decided to get really uncreative and say there's John and there's 1 John. Well, isn't the first one that comes in the order John? Shouldn't that be 1 John? Yes, but welcome to the scripture, okay? Sometimes it's a little bit difficult. So 1 John is the guy named John who was Jesus, one of Jesus' closest disciples. It was his go-to. John was one of his core followers, top 3 in the 12 disciples. And so John, who wrote extensively about the last 24 hours of Jesus' life, who has lived for a little while at this point, writes a general letter to Christians that we have as the book 1 John. And then at chapter 4, he goes into some things about love. And this is what he says. He said, in this, the love of God, in other words, God's love was made manifest among us, or it became present among us. That God sent his only Son into the world so that we might live through him. He said this is how God presented his love. This is how God made the intangible tangible, that he sent his Son. Verse 10 clarifies that. In this is love, pause, not that we have loved God. In other words, he says, let me tell you this. The starting point for loving God is not our love for God. The starting point for this realization, this acknowledgement, is not for me to simply say, you know what, I am going to decide today that I am going to love God. He said, in fact, the starting point has nothing to do with us, but everything to do with us. Nothing to do with what we do, but everything to do with what God has done through and for us. It says this. And this is love, not that we have loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins. He said, so this is love, that God saw us in our sinfulness. And it was the propitiation for us. And I know everyone's like, dude, 100%, I could tell you the exact definition of propitiation, okay? So for all of us who, that's a word that we don't commonly use in our lexicon, propitiation in its simplest form is an appeasement of wrath, an appeasement of wrath. In other words, there was a judgment, there was a condemnation that should have been faced, but wasn't faced because some form of payment was made to pay that payment, right? If I get a speeding ticket, if I am caught breaking the law, then I have to pay some type of a restitution to make the law now happy with me. Well, the deal is, and the concept of kind of what we view and what we believe as Christians, is that a lot of times Christians put forward this sense of morality. Be good enough, be good enough, be good enough, be good enough. When the gospel says the opposite. The gospel says you can't be good enough. You simply can't. We can't. I can't. You can't. We're all innately sinful. And because of that, we are unapproachable to God. It's almost like we're just fundamentally incompatible. You know, like whenever Apple comes out with a new product and it just frustrates you because they always change the little plug that goes in, and you already have like 75 things in a drawer that pick this one particular thing, but you try to put it in and it just doesn't work. That's basically in a wildly, almost like somewhat heretical minimization of us and God. That's kind of what we're talking about here, right? The consequence of our sin, because you and I all have that. By the way, when we talk about sin, we're not like, you are awful. It's like, no, we're all awful. Join the party. That because of our innate sinfulness, God in his holiness, we cannot approach his holiness. The infinite is not approachable by the finite. The pure and perfect is not approachable by the impure and imperfect. And we subjectively to one another can make ourselves feel good about ourselves, because you might be better than me and I might be better than you, where we can at least put on a facade like we are. But at the end of the day, we all have thoughts that we would never want people to know. We all have feelings we would never want people to know. We've all done things we would never want people to know. And because of our intentional rebellion, and I've said this all the time, but if you don't think we intentionally rebel, we do. We just call it spring break and we circle it on a calendar, right? We have all rebelled against God, and because of that, God is unapproachable to us. And God saw that, knew that, and didn't expect us to. And that's the beauty. And so what he did was the opposite. He sent his Son to pay that payment, to be the propitiation of our sins, to satisfy the wrath that we should have faced. And so John looks at this. He said, it doesn't start with us deciding that we love God. No, it's better than that. It's us realizing, not that we love God, but that while we were in rebellion, while we were against God, God was doing something for us and did do something for us. And his name was Jesus. He summarizes this beautifully in verse 19 after he goes through and talks about, man, if this is true, then we should have confidence. If this is true, there should be no fear, because a perfect love casts out fear. We shouldn't worry or be concerned about what happens at the end of life, because at the end of life is simply the reunification with God. And in verse 19, he brings it home and he says this: we love because. We love is the cause or is the effect, but the reason is, the because is, he first loved us. In other words, there is a sense of reciprocity, of affection and affiliation and deference when we understand what has been done for us. Let me tell you a story. Jeff Curlin was in the first service, and he's been with me since he was about in ninth grade. I'm like, Jeff, I'm pretty sure you've heard this 30 times. But it's one of my favorite stories because it just beautifully captures this idea in its kind of childhood essence. If you remember back to, if any of you guys played baseball or girls played baseball growing up, softball, whatever it might be, you have Cub League, right? And Cub League's when you hit it off a tee. I think it's Cub League, and then it goes like Atom League after that. And it's right before Little League. And Atom League is where, like, the second half of the season, you start pitching, right? Kids start throwing, which is, that's a science experiment gone wrong, I think. And you know how when you're young, I mean, you're probably 9 years old, something like that. They're not keeping score, but like, you're obviously keeping score. Parents are like, everybody won. It's like, no, we 100% won and y'all lost, and I can prove it. And so we would track throughout the season, and it just happened to be where our team was the best team. What can I say? And we were playing the other best team the last game of the season. Now, they didn't have like a tournament. It just kind of happened to work out this way this particular season. And so last game of the season, we're playing our team, best team, their team, best team. We're like, this is for the championship. And if you know ninth grade kids, especially ninth grade little boys, especially me when I was a ninth grade little boy, and this might not be all ninth grade little boy or 9-year-old little boys. Ninth grade, yeah. It's playing Adam League in ninth grade. It's a problem. Again, pray for me. But you know that like your existence rides and dies on your athleticism and wins and losses, right? And so, into the season, game goes on, and obviously, we'll just say this, like obviously your boy's pitching, okay? Like somebody's got to throw heat, and it might as well be me, okay? And we're up by 1 run going into the last inning, which if you, again, know Adam League, then like, man, kids don't do anything fielding-wise, so we're probably going to lose this game. Well, somehow we got the first out. Somehow we got the second out. In between that, a couple people got on base there on first and second and third, something along those lines. But I remember, it's now 2 outs, last inning, we're up by 1, 2 people on base, and I'm thinking the world rides on this. And if you know also Little League Baseball or Adam League Baseball or Cub League Baseball, there's 2 games, and the early game is great, but the late game is cool too. But the good thing about the early game is the people at the late game arrive for the early game. So there's a crowd, right? And in my mind, everybody's chanting, Ben, Ben, Ben. Pretty sure no one was doing that. Maybe my mom, right? But it's going down. And so I remember, like, I throw a couple pitches, and there's maybe a couple strikes, maybe a ball or 2. And a little piece of the puzzle that's important is that the kid who's batting he's like 9-year-old Goliath. You know what I'm talking about? Like that kid that's like, somehow he's 9-year-old and has a prepubescent mustache. You know what I'm talking about? Like, it's like, bro, what is this? And he's like, yeah. Like, all right, go back to the skate rink, dude. Right, but he's gigantic as a 9-year-old, and he like taps the plate, and like it's like on the Richter scale, it's like boom, boom. I don't really think it was, but like in my mind, this kid, he was monstrous, right? And so, couple pitches. Well, finally, it's 2 strikes, and this was like game on the line, right? So I just rear back, and I'm throwing fastest pitch I've ever thrown in my life. That's a lie, but we'll just say my velocity probably hadn't picked up a lot since then, right? But it's just flying down the middle. And Goliath, you can see it, takes a step, and he just starts to unload on this ball. And you maybe have been there where like in an instant, hope turns to catastrophe, right? You hear this little ping, and all of a sudden you're like, my life is over, and you're watching it go by. I remember he hit that ball so hard. Like, I'm sitting there thinking, like, I'm never going to go to school again. There it goes there. And I'm thinking, like, this whole thing is over with. Well, in center field, at that age, no one catches fly balls. You just have somebody there because they're the quickest person that could get to the ball once it hits the ground. And my buddy, David, who lived down the street from me, he floats back. And I'm sitting there watching him, and I'm like, no. And he puts his hand up, kind of like Sandlot-esque, right, where he's just like, and all of a sudden the ball, I can't make it up, the ball hits his glove, and I'm like, oh, because then you're waiting for it to pop out because you're 9, right? Hits his glove, and he catches it, and we're like, no, right? So we just like take off. We're dogpiling on top of David. He caught the ball, right? And so we're going ballistic when this happens. Well, the very next morning, we get to school early. We'd always play basketball. Now, I had a friend named Eric who was phenomenal at basketball. He was there. And I had first pick that morning. And the obvious thing would have been to pick Eric as my first pick, because he was better than everybody on the court. But you know who I picked? David. You want to know why? It wasn't because I was like, all right, so that was nice what you did for me, but, we'll see what happens next. It was David because I'm like, dude, like, when that guy hit that ball, I went from death, You caught it to life, right? Like this is 9-year-old salvation, right? Like I was dead, never going to show my face again, like in ruin and sin and misery. And you like baptized me in a baseball Adam League sense, right? Death to life, now here I am, right? But I kid you not. So that next morning, like I picked him first, has nothing to do with his athletic ability, had everything to do with the fact that he had what I just felt like had done this incredible service to me to help me. And so here's the idea of how that functions spiritually. That is, again, a gross minimization of what God has done for us, but no one at 9 years old had to teach me, Ben, what you ought to do is you really ought to pick David first. My dad didn't come back and say, Ben, let's have a pep talk. David did this. He helped you out. If you ever have a chance, you really ought to pay him back. You really ought to help him. No, I was like, dude, of course I'm going to pick you first. Of course, because you have just done something for me when I had no way out. You provided a way out. You caught the fly ball. You are now why I can be on this court and still have a sense of dignity left, right? Because you caught that ball. And here's the understanding, is there is a sense of reciprocity when you realize the depth to which someone has done for you. And when we get to the point where we realize in somewhat of a cosmic sense that we, in and of ourselves, have all rebelled from God, away from God, against God, but God sent his Son to us, for us, not because we loved him, but because he loved us, and not because we were lovable. In fact, the opposite, we were quite unlovable. Isaiah says it this way, that he sits enthroned above the circles of the earth, that the people are like grasshoppers. I love every one of you, but I would never let one of my kids die for a grasshopper. Probably not you either. Like, you're cool, but I have obligations. But can you imagine a grasshopper? Like, that's irresponsible almost. And subjective to you, and you subjective to me, we're like, no, but check out my grasshopperness. Like, have you seen the way I cricket my legs? Have you seen my Insta post? Right? Have you seen my bank account? Right? Have you seen my truck? And so we feel good compared to one another. But the reality is this, is that we have all sinned, we have all fallen short of the glory of God. But a love for God does not start with me deciding to love God. A love for God just starts with the realization of God's overwhelming love for me, despite of the fact that I am quite unlovable. Despite the fact that I have rebelled against him, despite the fact that I have circled it on my calendar, despite the fact that he is holy and God does not need me, which is the beauty, because that way he chose me. Let me tell you a little secret. You want to know our win for Sunday as a church? This is truth. This is what we talk about in our program stuff, in our meetings. Our goal as a church is Christ-centered life change. But we know we're not smart enough, good enough, spiritual enough to create Christ-centered life change in anybody. And so our goal for Sunday is that people would leave excited to come back and invite a friend. You want to know why? It's not because we're trying to have a bunch of people here. It's because I know that I am not good enough or spiritual enough to make somebody else love Jesus. I want to continue to set people in the same room, in the same row, so they continue to meet with Jesus and hear about Jesus. And perhaps the love of God for you will be overwhelming in your heart, and you will decide there is nothing on planet Earth that deserves my time, my attention, and my affection more than God. Thanks. Y'all all should have done that. All right, I'm going to do that again, so y'all, we can all right. Our time, our attention, our affection more than God. Oh, that's awesome. Anyways, so here's what I want us to do. Here's what I want us to do with all this. Here's what I want us to do with this information. If you're like me, because I was preparing for this, I'm going to be honest. I was preparing for this whole thing, and this morning, and kind of my Sunday routine is my alarm goes off at 5:45, 5:55. I give it a couple minutes, I roll out of bed, and I start, coffee, and I start thinking and praying and kind of reviewing and doing this. And I'm just thinking, God, I wish that I could say this with perfect moral authority. I wish I could say that, man, I always love God. But even this morning, I was thinking, do I really? Do I really? And then I just spent time thinking about the fact that God loved me in my sinfulness, my depravity, and my rebellion. And as a Christian, I fight and I live to please and to honor God, but sometimes still in my sinfulness and my depravity. And I want to love God. But I know it's tough for me. And so I'm assuming that can be tough for all of us. And so here's what I want you to do for the next week. And I would love for the next week to turn into the next month, and the next month to turn into the next year. But frankly, I lose my keys every day. So I don't know that I can make that kind of a promise, right? Here's what I want us to do for the next week. Not to decide to love God, because that would be putting the cart before the horse. Here's what I hope. Here's what I pray that you get from this. That the first anchor is a love for God. But a love for God is only accomplished through the realization of his love for us. And so my hope is that every day for the next week, at some point in the day, spend 2, 5, have 10 minutes, however long you want, and just thinking and contemplation about God's love for you. God's love for you. That God so loved you, he died for you. That God so loved you, he sent his one and only Son to die for a rebellious group of grasshoppers like us. That is almost, the depth of that is unfathomable. But when I find myself struggling for a love for God, it's because I've almost always either overestimated my holiness, underestimated his holiness, and I don't really conceptualize the gap of reconciliation that Jesus caused. Because if I do, when I realize how much God loves me, the fact that I wasn't lovable and he sent his Son to die for me, I'm telling you, it wells up in a sense that God, if you would do that for me, I'll do anything for you. I'll end with this reference. Paul in Romans 12 said it this way. He said, therefore, in view of God's mercy, in view of the extraordinary mercy that God had on each and every one of us, he said, in view of God's mercy, let's present our bodies, or to present your body, as a living sacrifice. God, anywhere, everywhere I'm in, God, I love you. You are the most important thing. You are the thing that everything else revolves around. To present our bodies as living sacrifices. He says, and this is our reasonable act of worship. He said it's only reasonable that we do that. So my goal for today is simply to say this. Anchor number one is we have to be a people who are passionately in love with God. But passionately in love with God only comes from the realization of God's passionate love for us. And if we get that, then everything else begins to fall into place. If we get that, then we begin to say, God, whatever you want, whatever you say, we're in. God, my life is for you. Everything I am is for you. Everything I have is for you. But it's not me making a declaration. It's me having an experience of the love of God for me that wells up a love back for him. So I hope and I pray and I'm asking for the next week, would you be willing to every day, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever it is, to simply stop and pray and spend some time contemplating the overwhelming love that God has for you. And if you're sitting here and you're wrestling with God, Jesus, Bible, faith, I just want you to think, how much different would it make you think about God if that were true? How much differently would you think about God if God wasn't a God who expected everything of you, but instead gave everything for you? My guess is you'd probably be a lot more open to God. Let's pray. Jesus, thanks for this time that we have together, and I pray that our affections to you, our love for you, would dwarf a 9-year-old on a basketball court. That it would be exponential in comparison. Because the depth of what you have saved us from, the level to which you have provided for us. Because every one of us, God, you know, we know, shares the commonality of the human nature, which is the sinful nature. And you never expected us to prove our way and to provide our way, but you made a way. His name is Jesus. To be the propitiation, to satisfy the wrath, the judgment, the condemnation that we should have faced. And God, I pray that you would make us into a people who genuinely and sincerely love you. This world has seen enough Christians who claim to love God but look nothing like him. And I pray that as we experience the overwhelming love for us, in spite of us, to make our brokenness whole, and reconciled to your sight. I pray that your love for us would well up inside of us so strong that reciprocity would begin to overflow and our hearts would be for you, but not as we decide for our hearts to be for you, simply as we experience your heart for us. And that we would be a group of people who the world would see, the world would look at, and say, I might never believe what they believe, but there's no doubt in my mind that they have an authentic love for God. God, I pray that that would be true of us. I pray that you would give us the wisdom every day to pause, the morning, the night, whatever time, and simply contemplate your love for us. And that would create a response of a love back to you. In Jesus'